Well, this week we are going to be discussing kinship and domestic life, and it's going to be interesting for you to see how cultures define and control uh, kinship and marriage and other forms of domestic life. Because once again, we're in our own cultural bubble, and we naturally make assumptions that the way we do it is the maybe the only way. There's those assumptions, or the normal way, or the right way. But as you'll see, there's many different ways of socially constructing both descent, which involves kinship, who we're related to, and how we think of family life and marriage and child rearing and that type of thing. So, as your book points out, learning a different kinship system can be as difficult as learning another language, because and actually when we get to kinship charts and the terminology involved with kin, you'll see that it is another language. It's an academic language, but it's based on different ways of thinking about that. So, what is a kinship system? Every culture has some form of a kinship system to, once again, define who are kin and who are not, who are relatives, who are not. So, the predominant form that kin relationships take in a culture, uh, and the kinds of what am I trying to say here? The kinds of behavior that involves determining who's kin and what your behavior to them and them to you is, that is what a kinship system is. So in all cultures, uh, kinship, the concept of kinship, is related once again to those modes of production we learned about and how they affect reproduction and things of that nature. So there's a chart in your book that describes that at the beginning of the chapter, and I just want to quickly go over it with you. So if you look at this, if you're looking at the foraging cultures, remember these are the modes of production. So if you're looking at the foraging cultures, the descent is usually bilineal. It's traced through both parents. Now, right there may be a different language for you to know, if you don't know that some cultures do not trace lineage through both the mother and the father, but only one or the other. So foraging is a bilineal descent system. They live in neolocal or bilocal residences. In other words, they create a new place to live, or they live very closely to, they live in a couple of places with one side of the family for a while or the other. And then they're also a nuclear family system. It's a small group of people. Those are foragers. When you look at the next three modes of production, it's almost the opposite. So for horticulture, pastoralism, herders, and agriculture, you have a unilineal one. Unilineal. Lineal means line. But when I was talking about a bilineal, I should have explained that term to you a minute ago with the foragers. Bi, two, and lineal refers to lineage or the line. And, the basis for the word lineage is line. What line do you descend from? So when you get out of foraging, now you get to horticulture, pastoralism, and agriculture. What you have is a unilineal, one line system. That can be traced either from the father's side, which is a patrilineal line of descent, or from the mother's side, which is a matrilineal line of descent. And we will get into this as we get further into the chapter in more detail. But as you might imagine, in unilineal systems, the majority of them are patrilineal rather than matrilineal. So that's the line of descent. What about residence? What happens when people marry? Where do they reside? It's either following the line of descent, either what's called matrilocal, which means you move into the bride's household, the bride's relatives, matra, mother, local, or patrilocal. Local refers to location. Patrilocal, where the new couple moves in with the husband's family, father. And what is the family system, the household type? It's extended. Okay. So can you see how it's the direct opposite of the foraging system, which is bilineal, neolocal, and a nuclear family. Okay. Now, guess what happens when you get to the industrialized and digital economies? It's just what we learned in the chapter on modes of reproduction based on livelihood. So it goes right back to the foraging. We, let's take the U.S. and Western Europe, etc., industrialized nations, bilineal. We trace our lineage through both of our parents. It's a neolocal residence pattern where we generally when we get married, we go establish our own new neo household in a different location than our parents. I mean, it can be, in the same state, in the same town, but it's a different physical location in terms of a house or apartment. And it's a nuclear family once again. So our system, the Western system, looks like the foraging system. And all other of those types of systems on Earth have a completely different opposite system of who is kin, where we live when we marry, how we raise, what kind of a system we raise families in, a nuclear household or an extended household. Okay, so, and then as you can see, that was linked to modes of production. Okay. So the early anthropologists found that the most important organizing principle in non-industrial state cultures was a kinship system, because that group of kin, of relatives, however that's determined, you'll see it's not necessarily through blood in many cultures, but they are considered, whatever is considered kin. That kinship group is what keeps you alive, basically. It performs the functions that ensure the continuity of the group, which would be the family, through marriages, through maintaining social order, rules, punishing offenders, breaking the rules, and it provides for the basic needs of the members through the production and distribution of and consumption of goods, and first and foremost being food, shelter, and that survival needs. So in large scale industrial digital societies, kinship ties exist, as we all have relatives, right? But they're not as crucial. And there are many other kinds of social ties that we can count on, or institutional ties. If our parents can't help us financially, if we have a crisis as adults or something, we can go to a bank and get a loan, hopefully, or somewhere, or maybe a friend will help, or we can move in with a friend rather than moving in with our families, a variety. So there are other social ties that are support systems in our type of society, in modern industrial digital societies. So can you see how then that loosens the foundational, crucial importance of kin in those functions that they provide? Now, the definition, I mentioned this earlier, the definition of who is kin differs widely in non-Western, like Europe and the U.S. cultures, and from other cultures, from indigenous cultures. And in the early 19th century, anthropologists did a lot of research on this. This is where the whole foundation of understanding kinship systems came from, was in early anthropology. So in Western societies like ours, in European societies, it's primarily blood relations, or relations that are that come from birth from a biological mother and a biological father. It could be your great, 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 great grandparents. Nonetheless, there's a biological mother and father involved in there in each generation from which you trace lineage, or we tend to trace lineage. But blood, as I mentioned earlier, is not a universal basis for kinship. And so even in cultures that have primarily a blood-based system, other cultures, not Western cultures, there are variations. Well, even in some of ours as well. We'll get to that down the road. But even in cultures with blood-based variations exist in definitions of who is a blood relative. For example, in some cultures, the male offspring is a blood relative, but not the female offspring. Okay. For the Inuit in northern Alaska, behavior is a non-blood basis for kinship. If you act and behave like kin, then they are kin. They are de facto kin. Okay. But if you stop acting like kin, then you're not kin anymore. And you will hear there's people in the Inuit culture will say that person used to be my cousin, but they stopped acting like a cousin, and doing the things that a cousin would do, and therefore they are no longer my cousin. Okay, there's no blood relationship there. It was based on behavior. So we're going to get into the kind of nitty-gritty of studying kinship. There are kinship diagram samples of Inuit, Eskimo, and Iroquois, just 2 out of the 6 kinship systems in your book. There's terminology and abbreviations that are used when you're working on those, and they're there just for examples for you. Very few of you are going to probably go on into deep study of this, but there are examples for you to see how different the systems are. And there is a method to the systems. They have their own very strict rules and obligations. So they'll see the symbols and the terminology. And one of the ways these symbols and terminology developed was that early anthropologists, when they did field work with groups, would ask questions like, what do you call your brother's daughter? You're going to see in a minute that it differs in many cultures from what we think what we call our brother's daughter. Another question, can you, if you're asking a man in a culture and you're an anthropologist, can you marry your father's brother's daughter? Another question, what is the term you use to refer to your mother's sister? Okay. And from this information then, the anthropologist could develop what's called a kinship diagram. Once again, there's examples of 2 in your text. And they could determine the whole lineage system, which involves, of course, who you can marry, who you can't, that type of thing. So all of those systems start with something called ego, which is the self. It's that person that I just said the anthropologist was asking the questions of. And then from that person's perspective, they give you those answers and you can develop those charts. So in cultures where kinship is extremely important, that person called ego, the person you're asking about whose relatives are and what you call them, can actually provide dozens of relatives to the person who's asking the questions. I thought this was so interesting incident that was referred to, that the author Barbara Miller had as a research study as a student, interviewed a student from an urban middle class family in India. And he could recall over 60 relatives, both on his mother's and father's side. Now, I defy any of us in a Western culture to be able to do that. Most of us can only go back a generation, 2, maybe 3. So a kinship diagram, a caveat here, is not genealogy. Genealogy starts from an ancestor in a family tree, starting with the earliest anybody can find, and then moving forward. It doesn't begin with, say, you or me describing our relatives and what we call them and what the rules are affiliated and associated with them. So with those kinship terminology charts, there's, as I mentioned before, there's 6 different types. We're only going to look at 2 of them. So one of the things to talk about, some of those questions I just asked, our terminology, which we have an Eskimo system. Those systems that are named Eskimo, Iroquois, the 2 in the book, they're named originally for the cultures that they were found in, and then every other culture who had a system like that is called that. So we, Western societies, have an Eskimo system, which is a nuclear, they're foragers. Remember, we talked about that. So nuclear family, bilineal, et cetera, et cetera. But before we get into that, it's really important to understand how different our kinship terminology is. If I ask you what you call your mother's father or your father's father, it's grandfather, right? Well, but that term grandfather doesn't tell me which parent's father that is, and neither does aunt or uncle or cousin. Cousin doesn't even tell you the sex of the person, the gender or sex of the person, right? It's just cousin. Grandfather or grandmother at least tells you the gender, but it doesn't tell you grandparent. No, it wouldn't. Okay. So other cultures would have terminologies that said for aunt in different cultures. You'll see when we get to Navajo, it's different, but in many cultures, it's the word that you use or combination of words is my mother's sister, my mother's mother, my father's brother. That would be the term you would use. It wouldn't just be a generic aunt, uncle, grandparent, because it's too important for marriage rules and kinship rules, depending on lineage, to not identify those folks. So in the Eskimo system, like we do, they use the same terms for both sides of the family, and it's a bilineal descent system. They trace their lineage from both sides, okay? Now, in the Iroquois system, it's completely different. It's a unilineal system. They trace it from just one side of the family, and they have different terms, as I just explained. For relatives from different sides of the family, you're going to come across some terminology called cross and parallel cousins. A cross cousin has a different either name, last name, or clan name, because it determines whether if the lineage comes through the mother's side or the father's side. If the lineage comes through the mother's side, then mother's sister's son or daughter is in the same lineage as you or the same clan as you, and that's a parallel cousin. But if the lineage if it's a matrilineal system, as I just described, the lineage is traced through the mother, the father's brothers or sisters' children are what are called cross cousins. They don't have the same clan name or last name, depending on what culture you're in, right? Okay. So in many cultures, the Navajo is an example. You can marry a cross cousin. In fact, they may be your preferred marriage partner, but marrying a parallel cousin is incest. And there's a very strong incest taboo against that in the Navajo culture and many other cultures. Okay. In terms of, from our perspective, blood, they're exactly the same. They're first cousins. They're just from different sides of the family. So that is a very powerful concept, is the cross and parallel cousins. So it's and then in the Navajo culture and many other cultures, one of the things that happens is that the same terminology for mother, that your mother's sister is also called mother, because so many female relatives are called, or the mother aspect of it is so incredibly important. And so it emphasizes when you call your mother's sister mother as well as mother, it emphasizes the solidarity of siblings and cousins. So no matter which system one uses, of the six that anthropologists figured out, literally 100 years ago now, it's all socially constructed. Can you see that? Can you see how our concept of first cousin marriage being taboo in many and illegal in many states, it doesn't hold true for other cultures. It's completely socially constructed in a different way. It's only one side of the family's first cousin that it's taboo for, but it has nothing to do with the way we think about it. That's what social construction means. So it's a constructed concept, and there's three factors that it's composed of generally: descent, sharing, and marriage. Okay, and they're all subject to change over time. So descent is tracing kinship relationships through parentage. So there's terminology here, and I wish once again we were in a classroom, I put it on a board for you. So lineal refers to lineage, the line that it comes through, the descent runs through. Bilineal, both parents. That's our system. However, I want to remind you that the vast majority of you have your father's last name. If you're a female, when you marry, you will take your husband's last name. So yes, we acknowledge both sides of our family, but the way we name and identify children primarily comes through the father's side in terms of naming only. We certainly acknowledge the mother's contribution genetically and all of that. So that's bilineal. Unilineal is through one parent only. It's either the mother or the father. If it's the father, it's patrilineal. Patri is the root for father, as in patriarchy. Matrilineal means the lineage is identified through the mother, matrilineal. So in the world, about 45% of cultures follow a patrilineal descent pattern, and that's primarily in South and East Asia, the Middle East, New Guinea, North Africa. The most strongly patrilineal cultures, as you might imagine, are in East and South Asia and the Middle East. In terms of matrilineal descent, about 15% of the world's cultures are matrilineal. The female line, the lineage runs through the female line only to mothers and daughters. Many Native American cultures, I mentioned the Navajo, but there are many other that, and a large part of Central Africa, parts of Southeast Asia, the Pacific, parts of Australia, the indigenous peoples in Australia, southern India, etc., and some of the Mediterranean coasts of Portugal and Spain are all matrilineal. And matrilineal societies are found among some foragers and some agricultural societies. So, but most of them are horticultural. So they're not, most of them, there's a few foragers, there's a few agricultural, but the vast majority where you find matrilineal societies are horticultural societies, because women are part of the production system. Okay, they dominate. We find those matrilineal lineages in foraging societies where women dominate the production and distribution of foods and other goods. They are often, the women in those cultures, recognized with public leadership roles and positions, and they mention the Iroquois and the Hopi, two American tribal groups in the United States that are matrilineal. And then there's, in your Culturama, there's a group in Indonesia that's the largest matrilineal group in the world, the Minangkabau of Indonesia. Now let's look at bilineal descent. That's both parents. equally to the children, about a third of the world's cultures. Does that surprise you? It's our system, but it's only a third of the world practice bilineal descent. And the highest percent are in the opposite modes of livelihood as we looked at, either foragers or digital, industrial digital. Both rely, and the reason that they're bilineal is because both of those systems rely on a very flexible gender division of labor, in which both males and females contribute more or less equally in making a living. And it makes sense because it provides smaller kinship units and it allows for spatial mobility where people are moving away. Remember, they're nuclear family systems and they're not part of this 60 relatives that the Indian student, East Indian student could, South Asians, I should say, Indian student could provide. So it makes sense that there would be bilineal in smaller families. And then marital residence, it primarily follows, of course, the kinship systems. So here's these terminologies, patrilocality, moving in with the father's family. I mentioned this matrilocality, moving in or near the bride's family, and then neolocality, new, starting a new residence. So what about sharing? Sharing emphasizes, and kinship is based on sharing. Who do we share our resources with? Who do we share our love with? Who do we share our emotions with? It's primarily kin until we, in the West, marry and establish our own family with whom we share all those things, rather than with our family of origin as much anymore. So it can be either formal or informal, the kind of sharing that we have with people we consider kin. And I'm going to read you this Malaysian system because I thought it was just so fascinating and so interesting, and I wanted to be sure that you got it. So how kin is one of the major foundations of kin in Malaysia is it begins when the mother's blood feeds the fetus. Then after birth, the mother's milk feeds the baby. So their belief is that a child who is not breastfed will not, quote, recognize its mother. And breastfeeding is also the basis of the incest taboo. So people who are fed from the same breast are kin and may not marry. Now think about this. That makes sense for brothers and sisters, right? Blood brothers and sisters of the mother. But what if it's a baby that was fostered with a mother and she breastfed it? And there was no blood relation, say, to her own daughter. And it was a male child, this baby, okay? Those two could never marry or get together. That's the basis of the incest taboo, even though there's no blood relation involved because they were breastfed from the same mother, which is the key here. After babies are weaned in Malaysia, then rice becomes the most important food, and it creates another way that kinship ties are created and socially constructed and maintained. And it's especially between women and children because it's the women preparing the rice and feeding the rice to the babies, and the men are often away doing other things, and they are not necessarily likely to have been feeding the babies, or the children, I should say, rice. They're not involved in that process. So those very, very strong kinship ties with mothers in Malaysia begin in utero, basically, and it has to do with feeding. So let's look at adoption and fostering. I mentioned that a minute ago. That's another form of sharing. And so the transfer of children from birth parents into someone else's care. So adoption, as in our country, in our culture, in most cultures, if you adopt a child, it's formal process and it's a permanent process. There are many reasons that people adopt children, both in our culture and in other cultures. So infertility, The desire to obtain a particular gender, that's not so common in Western cultures, but it certainly is in other cultures, and usually a son. So say there's two adult brothers and one brother's family only has girls. The other brother's family, I'm thinking about the Middle East. There was a film where this was part of the film that it was an anthropological film. And so the man who has only daughters has very low status in this Middle Eastern. It was an Egyptian culture, I believe, if I remember correctly, Muslim culture. So he can, but his brother has several sons, so he adopts one of his brother's sons, and that now he's okay. He's got a son, the father that only had girls previously. So that's a reason in other cultures. And then what was given in why the other brother with all the sons gave one to his brother to adopt was out of that kinship sharing basis. Okay, but many times adoptive parents or parents who are giving children up for adoption, it has to do with a premarital pregnancy in our culture and other cultures as well, having, quote, too many children. In the Depression in the United States, that's how there were tons of babies wound up in orphanages. Because of that, in the United States, people could not feed their children. Or too many of a particular gender is another reason we just talked. People will give up one of their children. So looking at the U.S. studies of adoption, the process in America of adoption tries, particularly in recent times, there's been a lot of work with this, changing the systems to be more open, tries to make a relationship to be as much as a biological family as possible, biological birth family. And there's, as you know, there's closed adoption and open adoption. And with the research shows that most adopted kids or adults want to explore and find their birth parents. So one of the points that they make here is that adoption legalizes a sharing-based kinship system, but it doesn't always replace a sense of descent. And that's why the kind of descent based on kinship in Western cultures comes from your birth parents. So that's why it's so important so often for adopted people to attempt to find their birth parents. So fostering, what's fostering? It's similar to adoption, but it may or may not be temporary. And it's not as formal a process. In Africa, many kids are fostered, if possible, usually going from rural areas to urban areas because it can enhance their chances in life. They can get an education in a city, for instance, or something of that nature. And that fostering is kind of a ritually established kinship. And it's common among Christians, if you think about, and especially Catholics worldwide, godparents are a form of ritually established kinship, where there's some kind of a ritual involved. And then you have some responsibility for that child, right? So now we're getting into marriage. And what's the definition of marriage? Well, there are lots of definitions of marriage depending on the culture. So we'll start with the idea that there is some form of marriage in all cultures and society. So the institution of marriage itself is what's called a cultural universal. But the way that institution of marriage manifests in different cultures is very different cross-culturally. So we're going to look at the Western standard definition of marriage from 1951, which looks both kind of funny and hopelessly outdated today, but here it goes. Marriage is a union between a man and a woman such that children born to the woman are recognized as legitimate offspring of both parents. So here's the implications of that. The parents must be of different genders. It clearly states that. It implies that children born outside of marriage are not socially recognized as legitimate. And so in the modern world, there are so many exceptions to those rules that definition involves. First of all, we have gay marriage today. Um, and when your book was written, it wasn't gay marriage in everywhere, but now legal. It questions that definition, the legitimacy of offspring. So many cultures around the world do not define legitimacy of children based on whether they were born in a marriage. And the idea of a child being legitimate or illegitimate is actually kind of a strange one if you think about it from a modern perspective. You can certainly understand why in the context of previous times that was true. But that's not such an important factor at all today, as you know. As in other cultures, their example here is Caribbean women who often don't marry until much later in life than typically Western cultures have. But in the meantime, they've had sequential male partners that they've maybe had children with. So when they finally get married, they may have 1, 2, 3 children from that many different partners possibly that come into their formal marriage when they finally formally marriage. So there are other definitions, of course, around the world, and some of them focus on the rights over a spouse's sexuality. That's pretty important in very strictly religious cultures. And not all here's another one that might throw you for a loop. Not all forms of marriage involve sexual relations. The Noor is an African culture, and they have what's called a woman marriage, where a woman with economic means will give gifts to a young woman who becomes a wife to the woman with the economic means, and they go through a marriage ritual, and going through the marriage ritual brings the young woman into the residential compound of this woman who gave her the gifts and is marrying her. But and so the new wife, what she's there to do is to contribute to the economic she has productive value in terms of work and labor in the household. The women don't have sexual relationships. She's called wife, the young woman, that is her title, but that doesn't involve sexual relationships. It involves her role in the household in terms of economics and production. And the wife, the one that's dubbed wife, that the older woman brought into the compound, will have sexual relations with a man if she chooses to, but her children will belong to the compound that older woman who brought her in runs and rules, basically. So, okay, so here's a more modern, you can see the different ways that marriage is constructed, and it's also socially constructed, obviously. And so here's a more modern definition. A more or less, here it is, okay, better working definition of marriage that your book has. A more or less stable union, usually between two people who maybe, but not necessarily, are co-residential, sexually involved with each other, and procreative with each other. Well, that one has a lot of maybes, right? Because that's the way marriage manifests today. There's so many different forms today. So let's look at spouse selection, because we all, if we're married or thinking about getting married, we all do this and or know people who did it because of our parents certainly did it at some point. So all cultures have preferences about whom one should and should not marry. I gave you the example of the Navajo and cross and parallel cousins, for example. Or they also have very powerful preferences and often rules and laws about whom one should or should not have sexual relationships with. And I, once again, take you back to that example of the Navajo and cross and parallel cousins. Sometimes those rules are informal and they're implicit, but sometimes they're very formal, written in law, and very explicit. So there are rules of exclusivity. That's who you may not marry in a culture. There are rules of inclusivity, and those are who are your preferred marriage partners. Okay, it's preferred that you marry. And then there's the incest taboo. Okay, and that is a strongly held prohibition against marrying or having sex with particular kin. And once again, that varies dramatically. Levi Strauss, who was a very famous, long dead, but a very famous anthropologist, said that the basis for the incest taboo was that it encouraged men to exchange women across physical territories, village to village, or something of that nature, right? And that incest taboo and that idea of exchanging women in outside of the immediate family was the foundation for all social networks beyond the immediate family, beyond the immediate group. And because different villages or different groups of people, if you're exchanging women among them, they have different resources, right, than your immediate family. They have access to different things, and you can provide different things to them. So from that, Levi Strauss's concept, that was the basis for the incest taboo that developed over a period of time. Now, as you might imagine, modern genetic research has a very different rationale for the incest taboo, an alternate theory, which is that, of course, larger breeding pools reduce the frequency of genetically transmitted diseases. Now, and that's true, as we know, and you can think of hemophilia as a major issue that runs through European royalty because they married very close, first cousin marriage and that type of thing. But incest has been defined differently and still is in many cultures. I hate to keep going back to the Navajo, but it is literally incest to marry, breaks the incest taboo, crosses the incest taboo to marry a first cousin from the paternal side, but not from the maternal side, okay? So that's how it's defined, how it's socially constructed. And, as an example, as your book points out, that, Egyptian royalty married each other. They married brothers and sisters, they married fathers, etc., and sons, because if you are a god or a goddess, as pharaohs were, who else are you going to marry except someone else in that same sacred lineage? But interestingly, there were 15 to 20% of Egyptian marriages were between brothers and sisters. That wasn't the royalty during the period of the Roman occupation, because the Romans wrote all this down in their history. So and these also, the incest taboo has to do with these terms, exogamy and endogamy. Whenever you see G-A-M-Y as the suffix of a word, the end of a word, that refers to marriage. Think of monogamy, okay? That's marrying, a single, mono, okay? And whatever the prefix is, mono in that case, tells you what kind of marriage it is. So there's two general kinds, exogamy and endogamy, okay? Endogamy is marrying within a group or a village. It can be a locality or within a group. It can be within a caste system. Endogamy is marrying within the same caste. As in India, you would never marry outside of your caste in India. Okay. Exogamy is moving outside, either out of a village, out of a community, etc. And people do both. For example, historically in America, for the most part, Jews married Jews, Catholics married Catholics. That's endogamy. Okay. But they might move far away to a different Jewish community when they married. So they married within the group, but they physically moved away. Hypogeny, okay, G-Y-N-Y ending always refers to female. It's a Greek root for female. Think of gynecologist or whatever else you can think of. Hypogeny is marrying up, okay? And that's when the bride's status is lower than the groom, and she marries someone richer, more educated, with more power than her, okay? Isogamy means equal. That's when that's what most, it's also called homogamy, marrying the same. That's the most common, certainly in the United States. People tend to marry people from the same socioeconomic class, which includes income and education, and often the same religion, and I'm talking broad strokes here, Protestant, of which there are many denominations, as you know. Racial and ethnically, people tend to marry people like them. Okay, so the thing to think about, and we obviously don't think about those things consciously necessary. It's who are you going to meet, right? You're going to meet the people that you go to school with in the community you go to school. If it's a very wealthy community, you got a wealthy school or a private school, whatever. If you go to college, you're going to meet people in college, and you all wind up having degrees and making more money, et cetera, okay? You meet people at work. Your work depends often on your education again, right? So you get the point how that works. It's not necessarily an intellectual process at all. It's just where we are. It's called propinquity, actually. It just means physically where we are operating in life. Those are the people we meet where we are, right? So you can't marry somebody you don't meet. Well, I used to be able to say that. Now with the internet, of course, you can kind of do that. Hypogeny is a little bit different. There is a little bit of hypogeny and hypergeny. Hypergeny is marrying up. Hypogeny is marrying down. There is often some calculation involved with marrying up, trophy wives, for example. And some of these really old duffers, and not very attractive men have these gorgeous wives. Why? Well, they're rich and powerful men, and there's a big trade-off there. So that's marrying up. What about romantic love? Not so much in other cultures. It's a very, very, very Western and particularly American concept. So I always like to tell a story about Romeo and Juliet. We think of that in the West as being this love story. Well, actually, it was a cautionary tale. And I can always kind of visualize Renaissance parents dragging their teenagers to the Globe Theater to see this play, to point out to them what happens if you don't let parents take care of arranging your marriage. What happens at the end of Romeo and Juliet? Everybody's dead, right? Because these teenagers were not capable of figuring it out themselves about what was best for the family, the contractual issues of families, right? Lineage, property, inheritance, those types of things. So romantic love is not something that's valued in many other cultures because those things, lineage, property, inheritance, etc., are much too important to be left to people who are having some kind of crazy experience of, pheromones going nuts and being terribly attracted to someone, and often mistaking those kinds of attractions for lasting love. Lasting love, the foundation is much more than physical attraction, which, as I'm sure you're aware, in marriage, the average length is about 6 months of that kind of passion, 6 months to a year. Well, then you better have something else, some other basis for a lasting relationship. It's after that period of time that people begin to really discover that, wait a minute, I mean, I don't agree with him or her about anything, or I don't want to raise the children that way, or, a variety of other things that nobody thought about or talked about in the beginning, because there was this flame of romance going on that yes, can be very overwhelming. But can you see where other cultures want to have historically wanted to kind of put a box around that and think about further down the road? Okay, so which gets us to arranged marriages. Okay, that's the parents' consideration, the family's consideration, depending on the culture, about what's a good match. In India, astrology is hugely important. That's one of the first things that is matched, to look at the astrological charts and signs of the potential marriage partners. And then it also involves caste. It involves education levels, certainly professions, and those types of things. And historically in India, for years, potential spouses didn't necessarily even meet each other until the wedding, and then the bride, and the veiling of a bride in India, and then the groom would lift the veil, and it might be the first time they saw each other. That's not true in modern India at all, and the potential bride and groom certainly have the ability to say, not that one. And there's a very interesting series, I think it's on Amazon, it could be Netflix, and I think it's called Indian Matchmaker or something like that. If I can, I might put it up for you as a link. It's because you could see the process through various different couples in different episodes of them going through and following what's involved in getting Indian young people married. It's really a process. It is. So that's. I think that there's more marriages in cultures that are arranged in terms of numbers of people, at least up until modern time, than there were just letting people decide it on their own, and particularly very young people decided on their own. So there's different marriage gifts. A dowry is when the transfer of cash or goods from the bride's family to the groom's family. Okay. A bride price is the opposite. It's the transfer of cash and goods from the groom's family to the bride's family, much less common. A dowry is much more common. In India, there are things called, they're not as prevalent now, but there was a rash of them maybe 10 or 15 years ago, you could look it up, called dowry burnings, where it's a horrible thing, but young brides would be burned to death, because then you can get another bride and get more stuff from another family. And they had to do big publicity, campaigns to stop dowry burnings. Remember that in India, women are wearing saris, which are either very fine cotton or silk, and they're cooking over kerosene stoves or open flames, and it only takes a second for a mother-in-law to kind of push a daughter-in-law enough that part of the sari catches on fire. That's how those dowry burnings occurred, was while cooking over open fires and kerosene stoves and things of that nature. So that was a horrible aspect of dowry. But, and it's not as common anymore, but as I said, you can look it up. Bride service, bride price, as I said, is when the groom's family gives gifts or money to the bride's family, much less common than dowries. And then bride service is when the groom works for a potential father-in-law for a period of time, and that's more common among uh, pastoralists. They'll come and they'll do herding and work with the animals and that type of thing. Some horticulturalists also, and then you can marry once you've done that. So the last part of this section has to do with various forms of marriage. So let's go through that. We got monogamy. I talked about that earlier. That is mono, single, one man, one woman, form of marriage, gamy. Now, we say we practice monogamy in the United States. We have, and legally that's true, but because it's illegal to marry more than one person at a time. However, what we truly have is what's called serial monogamy. We have monogamy in a series. We have the highest divorce rate of any industrialized nation. You can have as many husbands or wives as you want to in America. I think Elizabeth Taylor had 8 or 9. But you can only have them one at a time. So you have to get legally married, legally divorced, then legally married, then legally divorced, et cetera, et cetera. If you're going to marry, of course, you can live with anybody as often as you want. But okay, so that's monogamy. Polygamy is a generic term. It doesn't mean a man married to more than one wife. It means any form of marriage where there's more than 2 people in it. Gamy marriage, poly, many. I know that it is used as a generic term for what is actually polygyny, which is a form of polygamy where a man marries more than one woman. Ginny, G-Y-N-Y. Okay. Polygyny, polybeny, women. Okay, so that's that's the most common form of polygamy. And in the U.S., I guess the Mormons were the most famous for that, but it's very common around the world. But there is another form of polygamy called polyandry. Andros is the Greek word for male, the Greek root for male. So that's a form where there is one woman and more than one man. So that is, as you might expect, a much rarer form of polygamy. But those are the basic forms of marriage in terms of how many people are involved in them. All right, we'll pick up mid-chapter next week.